Augmentative communication is a science with a relatively short history, although people have been unable to speak since the beginning of antiquity. I would like to look in at augmentative communication in the 1970s, more or less when I joined this field, this emerging field. And in the 1970s we were finding that people all over the United States and in many other countries, in Canada and in England and in Europe, were dealing for the very first time beginning in a systematic way with the needs, the communication needs of people who were physically impaired and also physically or cognitively unable to speak. And I would like to call the 1970s in augmentative communication an era of access. Everybody was trying to get access for a friend, access for the son of a colleague. We were trying to develop means for physical access. The era of the 1970s in augmentative communication, in fact, I would call the era of access. But like all things in history evolved, what started out as a field primarily concerned with access, to its credit, solved many of those issues of access. Today we can buy very well done commercial switches from a wide range of companies, Don Johnson Development Equipment, Tash, Prentke-Romick. But beginning around 1980, a change occurred. And that is, after we'd gotten hundreds and hundreds of people fairly good access, we found we were not still meeting their communication needs. And the focus changed from access to language. What I'm going to talk about now are some fundamental linguistic issues. This is going to be augmentative communication as told through the eyes of a linguist. I'm going to talk about some fundamental linguistic issues in augmentative communication, and I'm going to focus on language representation, because language representation is an important issue in and of itself, and in our field it takes on a particular importance. Let me say that the early systems, most of them, the electronic systems, were based on letters. And I'm thinking here of Rick Fold's Tufts Interactive Communicator. I'm thinking here of Howard Shane's Communicator. These programs gave individuals access to letters. These were wonderful first draft systems. And the things that were learned from these systems are still in use today. The major arrangement for scanning systems for alphabetic configurations is primarily derived from Rick's work at Tufts in the 1970s. But folks, let's take a look. What's wrong with letters as a medium of expression in augmentative communication? Well, number one, letters are based on sound. Well, that's good in itself, because even children with severe physical impairments can be shown to have real significant phonological absorption. And they can understand the difference between back and pack. Rudiments of phonology are in there for children with many different cognitive statuses. However, a language representation system based on sound is also based on articulation. And I believe it's intuitively clear that if you aren't able to articulate, there are definitely going to be some issues in using a language representation system based on what you can't do. Okay, so that letters are based on sound is an issue, and it's a challenge to pedagogy, and it's going to require some special attention. Second, there are many letters in a sequence. I had a really nice flight from Los Angeles to Pittsburgh last week. How many letters would a sentence like that have? Well, I believe that that would have approximately 45 to 55. Should we count? Oh, I think not. Let's just say it has 50. All right. If an augmented communicator could make one key actuation every 5 seconds, how long would it take him or her to access that sentence? Well, 5 times 50 becomes, what would that be? That would be 250 seconds. How many minutes would that be? Oh, I think that would be on the order of 4 minutes. That's a very long time. So let me underscore here that one of the problems with letters is that there are many symbols in a sequence. Well, what's an answer to some of these problems? Well, an early answer to this, dating back to the 1970s, was Bliss, a wonderful system devised by Mr. Bliss, Mr. Charles K. Bliss of Australia. And along with it, I would like to pair picture systems. But I'm going to talk primarily about Bliss because it's such an interesting system and allows very interesting language organizational possibilities. First off, Bliss answered the sound issue by being based on concept. Let me talk about concept for just a moment, and let's talk about Bliss symbols. Here are some Bliss symbols. This is Bliss for person. It shows a guy standing there. This is Bliss for action. It shows the first action on Earth, the rising up, the volcano. This is Bliss for creation. It is the first clothesline figure and was a symbol of the Pythagoreans for God. And Mr. Bliss used it for creation because it creates a space within inside itself. This is Bliss for protection. Well, watch how these symbols combine. Let me take the person symbol and mix it with the action symbol, and we find action person, which Mr. Bliss called man. Notice how it seems to have the characteristics of pants here. He called it man. Creation person, Mr. Bliss called woman. Not that Mr. Bliss didn't have some cultural baggage of his own here. Let's take a look at this form. This form represents protection. What Mr. Bliss thought he had found, by the way, was a way in simple line figures to represent the semantic atoms. And these semantic atoms were what made up the molecules of meaning. So through combining his semantic atoms, let's see if we can come to some real molecules of meaning here. Okay, this is action person. Let's take a look at protection action person. And we have father. How would we make mother? Well, protection creation person becomes mother. A form of this becomes family. Lest you think that it is all as intuitively obvious as that, let's take a look at never. But this really makes sense too. X all by itself means many. Square all by itself means thing. If you put many inside the square, you come up with the Bliss concept of all. This is Bliss for clock. So this means always. Not always means never. So although this appears to be complex, it is soundly constructed. And it is soundly constructed from constituent elements that make sense. So folks, Bliss was a very interesting, or is a very interesting way of representing language based on concept. 2. Many symbols in a sequence. Well, how many symbols in a Bliss sequence do you need? Well, not as many as you do in letters. So in a Bliss sequence, you might need 5 or 6 different symbols to construct the whole English sentence. Now, of course, this implies some interaction on the part of your conversational partner. But let's put here few in a sequence. Well, it looks like we've had our question answered, haven't we? The two primary problems that we discovered using letters to represent language, sound and many symbols in a sequence, we have seen to be dealt with by Bliss, or sometimes picture systems, with based upon concept and few in a sequence. Well, why aren't we here now? Why isn't this the full answer? Well, the full answer is not available until we consider one of the really great things about the letter system, and that is 3. Letter systems have small symbol sets, and they are generative. There are only 26 letters in the Roman alphabet, the one that we use to express English, and space, which you need to count when you're counting letters. So with only 27 characters, we can create every word in the English language. That is a wonderful thing about letters. Let's look over here at Bliss, or with picture systems in general. Number 3, we find we get a very large symbol set. Now, a large symbol set can be very useful and is necessary in Bliss and picture systems, but what does that do to our system operator to have, say, 500 symbols or 1,000 symbols or 1,500 symbols? In fact, the Bliss system has 1,400 approximately basic symbols and another 2,000 specific symbols. So there's really quite a large symbol set. And many other systems have thousands and thousands of symbols. If we would like to take as an example a language that's based in this way, we have Chinese. Chinese has many thousands of ideograms. Now, right here we have encapsulated one of the major issues in language representation. It's such a major issue that I feel I need to highlight it in a special way and section it out, because I believe it is a central language representation issue that has a very important consequence in augmentative and alternative communication. And it is this, that there is a mathematical, proportional relationship between the size of the symbol set and the length of the symbol sequence, or length of symbol string. If you have a small symbol set, you are almost always perforce going to have many of those symbols in a string. If you have few symbols in a sequence, you're going to have a large symbol set. That, unfortunately, is the way it works. It's a mathematical law, it's proportional, and is Mother Nature's way of encoding. Now, what is it that every augmented communicator needs and wants in his or her language representation technique? I believe it's to have a small symbol set and few of those symbols in a sequence. Let's take, for example, an augmented communicator. A woman, 44, a lawyer, vice president of a university. And it's been possible to release funds. She's had a brainstem stroke. And it's possible to release funds to do the best of all possible language representation systems for this attorney. So, are we going to design a language representation system that has a large or a small symbol set? Well, I think we're going to try to design one that has as small a symbol set as possible, because although many clinical issues such as swallowing and other things have been taken care of, our attorney is going to be using a single switch to interface. So we're going to want a small symbol set. Now, how many of these symbols are we going to want in the sequence? Well, if we make long strings of these symbols, isn't that going to take an awful long time to communicate? Well, I think it is. So we want few symbols in a sequence. So what is wanted is a small symbol set with few symbols in a sequence. What nature gives us is, if you have a small symbol set, you get many symbols in a sequence. If you want few symbols in a sequence, you have to have a large symbol set. Chinese is the classic example. To read a Chinese newspaper requires a knowledge of more than 2,000 symbols. That's quite a lot. Chinese scholars know between 7,000 to 9,000 symbols. That's again quite a lot. But have you ever been by a Chinese restaurant and seen a name such as Heavenly Oriental Garden written out in English, and then see 3 Chinese characters representing that? By the massive size of the symbol set, the language representation technique is able to achieve the kind of specificity that allows you to use very few symbols in a sequence. So this is an example of a very large, this is an example of the mathematical proportional relationship. In Chinese, you have few Chinese symbols in a sequence, but you have a very large symbol set. In English, using the Roman alphabet as we do, we have a very small symbol set, but yet we need many of those symbols in a sequence. Everyone who has ever worked in augmentative communication has been touched by this contradiction, this problem. For instance, in making a manual system, how many of us have made manual systems and then started having to use mini boards because we did not have enough room on our manual system to put the vocabulary that we wanted? So our mini board grew and grew and grew. Many times I've walked into rehabilitation centers and into cerebral palsy centers and seen individuals carrying around with them very large picture books that they put on the table and then thumb through. This is all about the contradiction between the size of the symbol set and the length of symbol string. In order to get one hit per concept, we've had to sacrifice the kind of smooth efficiency we get with a small set of symbols. So we've had to make all the different compromises to go to a large set of symbols. And in fact, this issue has become so important in augmentative communication that during the 1980s, the era that I call the era of language, it has generated out 4 separate and independent approaches to this. And almost all the available approaches to this issue can be summed up in the following chart. These 4 techniques are abbreviation, letter-based word prediction, levels, and semantic compaction. Each one of these is trying in its own way to address this fundamental mathematical proportional problem noted between the size of the symbol set and the length of symbol string. Abbreviation. What is it that's the problem here? Let's sum that up again just briefly. Every augmented communicator wants or needs a small symbol set and few of those symbols in a sequence. So the problem areas are twofold. When you take advantage of a small symbol set, you get many symbols in a sequence. When you have a system that has few symbols in a sequence, you generate out a large symbol set to support that brevity of sequence. So this is the way Mother Nature construed language encoding, and these 4 systems are efforts at dealing with that kind of an issue in the context of augmentative and alternative communication. Abbreviations, letter-based word prediction, levels, semantic compaction. Let's take each one in turn and look at the problems and possibilities inside that approach. The first approach is the abbreviation system. Now, what I want to say about abbreviation systems can be summed up in the following way. Abbreviation systems have a problem primarily because of the small symbol set, and that is, the problems are these 2. An abbreviation set will soon become unprincipled, and after it becomes unprincipled, it will become arbitrary. Let's take a look at these words. Now, abbreviation systems can be used to abbreviate words, phrases, or sentences, but right here I'm going to use these primarily to abbreviate words. And let's look at what would be a good 2-letter abbreviation for each one of these words. Well, I think a good 2-letter abbreviation for work might be WK. A good two-letter abbreviation for word might be WD. But now if we look for a good two-letter abbreviation for walk, we have an issue, because our principle, though unarticulated, was that we were picking the salient first and last letters, WK, WD, and now we have a collision. So we're going to have to leave our principle, and let's say we pick WL. Well, what would be a good two-letter abbreviation for world? Well, we can't use WD, we can't use WL, let's use WR. And WR invokes yet another problem, because WR is the first two letters of a whole series of words like wrong and right and wrist and wreck. So if we're going to use WR as an abbreviation, we're going to have a third key. And that third key is going to be something like an abbreviation recognition key. So although this will remain a two-letter abbreviation, it will become in fact a three-stroke abbreviation. After a while, we're not going to be able to use two-letter combinations because we'll run out of two-letter combinations related to our words. So we're going to have to start using three-letter combinations, and there too we're going to have to use my goodness, now it's a fourth key to indicate the abbreviated nature if we want to encode a large amount of language. So that's a special issue in itself. Now let's take a look at would. What would be a good abbreviation? Well, let's try WU. Now, I'm not quite sure how many hundreds of abbreviations like this we'd have to have before it would become confusing, but I think it's very obvious now what I mean by unprincipled. We started out with a simple enough principle, although it was unarticulated, kind of a salient first and last letter, and we've found how far we've gone from that. And in fact, as we became unprincipled, toward the end we started becoming arbitrary. And I would just like to illustrate how arbitrary this encoding system is in the following way. WK could be the abbreviation for work. It could also be the abbreviation for walk. WD could be the abbreviation for word, but it could also be the abbreviation for world, and it could also be the abbreviation for would. I'm saying arbitrary now because by that I mean there's no rhyme or reason why WD was chosen for word instead of being chosen for world or instead of being chosen for would. WL is a good abbreviation for walk, but it could also be a pretty good abbreviation for world and in turn a good abbreviation for would. WR could have been an abbreviation for word, for world, for word, or for work. So here we have our 5 words, and we find that their abbreviations have become unprincipled and finally arbitrary. WK for work seems to be principled, as does WD for word, but as we see, they are in fact arbitrary because they would be adequate abbreviations for other words. So this abbreviation is unprincipled, this one is unprincipled, this one becomes unprincipled, this one is unprincipled. The only one that is not unprincipled is almost totally arbitrary. So this is the problem with abbreviation systems. They soon become unprincipled or arbitrary, and learning a large or a substantial vocabulary becomes very difficult under these circumstances. Thus we see the first of our 4 paradigms, the first of the 4 to grow up in the 1980s, we see that it has serious issues. It can be a very effective means of representation only for small language sets. But if the needs of the client are for large-scale language or for interactive communication using the rate enhancement or the enhancement technique, we see that abbreviation systems don't work too well. The second of our 4 approaches is letter-based word prediction. Just like abbreviation systems, letter-based word prediction aims at lowering the numbers of symbols in a sequence. Both of them accept letters as the primary language representation medium, and both of them are aimed at the primary problem here with letters, and that is the many symbols in the sequence. Word prediction sounds like and feels like, to a degree, a very good idea, but it too engenders certain problems. Some of them are very serious. The problems that I have in mind deal with the language psychology of generation. Let me first describe to you how letter-based word prediction systems operate, and then I'll talk about their problem. In a letter-based word prediction system, if one were to say, enjoyable is the word I would use to describe my trip to Idaho. I would sit at a computer or at some other device with a word prediction system, and I would actuate a key for E. And then on the computer screen, I would find a list of words which begin with E. Enjoyable probably would not be there, although it could be. Then I would actuate an N, and I would get another list of words which I would read. And let us say enjoyable would be the 5th word on that list. And then I would hit number 5. And so I would get the word enjoyable. And I would experience a great enhancement in keystroke efficiency, to wit, I would lower the number of symbols in a sequence required for actuation. As neat as this idea sounds, it produces very characteristic stresses when it is used as the primary rate enhancement technique. And that is, it tends to engender a very serious interaction between the communicator, not and his communication partner, but between the communicator and his language generation system. To put it in another way, the amount of psychological and physical energy it takes first to hit a key, to move my eye focus and my cognitive focus, read a list, return, hit another key, read a list, recognize a word on that list, select the letter, is very cognitively distracting and interferes with the language generation process. It has been my personal experience that many system operators who use this kind of rate enhancement technique ignore it or speak in rather short, stereotypic sentences. Because if I were to say, enjoyable is the way I would describe my last trip, after interacting over enjoyable, I don't know that I'd be able to remember the rest of what I was going to say. Have you ever been sitting at a typewriter and tried to work very hard to get all of your sentence in before you forgot what the end of the sentence was? I know that happens to me often. And because I don't type too quickly, what I sometimes do is sketch out the rest of the sentence off to the side. Well, picture this as a language generation style, and you can understand where a person's mind is going when he or she is picking a letter, reading a list, picking a letter, reading another list, selecting a number. There has been not an awful lot of research in augmentative and alternative communication concerning the various effectiveness levels of our systems, because, as we said earlier, our field is somewhat in its infancy, but there have been some very interesting summaries. And one of them that I'm going to talk about is a summary of research done by Heidi Horstman. And she noted that many word prediction systems predicted a keystroke efficiency of 50% and up. But her summary of the literature of the actual results showed that although the keystroke efficiency predicted for the system was 50% or up, the actual achieved rate enhancement was 0 to 10%. This was presented at Resin in 1991. So, let's review for a moment word prediction systems, and let's see how they fit into our overall paradigm. Both abbreviation and letter-based word prediction systems are techniques for dealing with the fundamental contradiction in augmentative communication, namely the need for a small symbol set
with few symbols in a sequence. Their way to go about achieving this is to accept the bounty of the small symbol set provided by the alphabet and trying to reduce the number of symbols in the sequence. We find in both cases that the efforts to fool Mother Nature, well, remember that old ad, it's not nice to fool Mother Nature? That the efforts to fool Mother Nature have unintended secondary consequences. Namely, the encoding techniques of the abbreviation systems become very difficult to remember because they're unprincipled and arbitrary, and because the word prediction systems engender a great deal of interaction not between the communicator and his communication partners, but between the communicator and his communication aid. Communication. Communication between the communicator and his communication partner, and communication between the communicator and his communication aid. I've just put an interesting topic, or at least interesting to me, an interesting topic on the table, and that is, at least as suggested by it, what are the goals of augmentative communication? We're pretty sure the goal is not communication between a person and a communication aid. It is between a person and another person. And that might be through the medium of speech, or it might be through the medium of print, but it is communication. And here, now that we have come through two of the different language representation techniques in augmentative communication, a good half of them, I think it would be appropriate for us to pause for a second and scrutinize what might be the actual goals of augmentative communication. The goal of augmentative communication, the goals of augmentative communication, as I perceive them, are twofold. The first is expressive competence, and the second is the use of literacy. I would like to explain just a little bit, or expand a little bit, on what I mean here. By expressive competence, I don't just mean the ability to hear and understand, although that's very important. What I mean by that, what I'd like to say about that, can be summed up in a few statements that I've written here about expressive competence. Number one, receptive competence is not enough in relationship to augmentative communication. The second thing I'd like to say is that receptive competence is never really achieved without some expressive experience and some expressive abilities. And so I would like to posit as one of the real goals of augmentative communication, communicating with people. And I believe that communication has to be spontaneous, interactive, goal-generated communication by an individual, not just the didactic exchanges of the therapy setting, or the use of very small vocabularies in tightly constrained situations. These may be very good and very helpful for priming the pump, but they are not the goal in itself. And our language representation technique, whatever one we use, must be based on the notion that we're going to go beyond the goal of setting up therapies and into actual expressive communication. So, number one, I think the main goal of the main two goals of augmentative communication, we have one, some expressive competence. Two, use of literacy. Do I mean by literacy the ability to read complex novels? Well, for some, that is certainly a desirable and achievable goal, but not necessarily for everybody. But everybody has, perhaps we might say, literacy needs. People need to be able to read the signs of life, such as men and women on a men's room, in order to be able to lead independent lives, or to lead lives as independent as they can be. So we live in a print-dominated world. Print and video are everywhere. And video is deeply print is deeply enmeshed in video. We need to have awareness of letters. We need to know how letters are used. and we need to be able to use them however limitedly and according to the skills that we may have, or to the abilities we have to develop skills. So for me, the two goals of augmentative communication are, number one, expressive competence, and number two, the use of literacy. Now that we've put those on the table, as it were, let's go back to discuss our paradigm as we have set it up. And to do that, I would like to return to the notion of the four approaches to augmentative communication language representation. We've talked about abbreviations. We've talked about abbreviations with the backdrop in our mind that what we're doing is not encoding just a few words or a few phrases or a few sentences, but really having a rate enhancement, a representation technique that will enable us to achieve expressive competence. With letter-based word prediction, we have talked about letter-based word prediction, critiquing it actually, because of the problems it has in promoting expressive competence. The problems it has in enhancing the rate above the letter-by-letter rate, or enabling people to break through the short stereotypic sentences that are engendered when you can't quite remember where you were going with that sentence as you were picking through the different aspects of the system. Now, what I would like to do is return to look at the other two paradigms of augmentative communication, namely level systems and semantic compaction, now in the light of the two goals that have been posited for augmentative communication. Let's return to our third paradigm of the 1980s. This is the levels location system. Many of us have seen these systems. The Wolf is a levels location system. The Prenke-Romic Express is a levels location system. There are many different levels location systems. And I would just like to summarize them very briefly by saying that they are efforts to deal with the large symbol set. How are they efforts to deal with the large symbol set? Well, let me just point this out. Levels assumes that you get the benefit of very few symbols in a sequence gotten from concept-oriented systems to what? Basically a single hit, or very short sequencing at best. And what they do is they proliferate out a large number of symbols. And then they develop various navigational means to get to the appropriate symbol. I would divide level systems into dynamic levels and static levels. A dynamic level system allows the machine itself to change its own levels, and a static level system requires an able-bodied colleague or communication partner or facilitator to change overlays. I'm going to begin this discussion with talking first about the static systems, how they can be used, and what they're not very useful for. By a static system, I mean something like the Prenke-Romic Express or the Wolf, where a limited amount of vocabulary can be placed on an overlay, and then that overlay can be changed. And I'm going to talk about this in the most simple kind of terms, basically so we can get through this sort of material. One, if we have, say, 7 overlays, 7 different overlays, let's assume that our vocabulary is evenly distributed among these overlays. Let's say we have an AM activities overlay, a PM activities overlay, a sheltered workshop overlay, a transportation overlay, a bowling overlay, a dressing overlay, a foods overlay. I could go on, but let's just say that there are 7 primary overlays. Then with these 7 overlays, what percentage of our vocabulary, it's evenly distributed, is on each overlay? Well, I've already done the math. And the math would indicate that approximately 14% of our vocabulary is on each overlay. So when we're communicating, that means that approximately a little over 85% of our vocabulary is out of reach. Can you imagine spontaneous, interactive communication with only 14% of your vocabulary available in front of you? And what's more, how would you know what vocabulary you have available in front of you? You would know simply by observation. And how is it that thoughts arise in your minds? I think it's a little bit different. The need or the urge to communicate wells up within us and goes out onto the surface. It does not come from observing external objects, external stimuli, and then formulating language. The static systems may be very good for teaching concepts and for providing initial experience with communication, for doing highly topic narrow communication, where an individual is provided with a contrived situation where he or she only has 5 or 6 different things to say. This kind of system can provide very important early interactive experience. But this kind of a technique cannot carry us very far because it seems to be relatively unlinguistic, meaning that it doesn't follow the regular way people generate speech. And it does some other things. For instance, there's been an awful lot of research into what is called item bias and position biasing. Item biasing is where people select by what they see, and position biasing is people select by where they see it. And I know every time I rent a car, I have a gear shift on the steering column, and I get a gear shift on the floor, I keep grabbing at my steering column for the 2 or 3 days it takes me to get used to that until I get back home, at which time I start grabbing toward the floor. Can you imagine if a statement like, "I hate mushrooms," is at one location, and that same location is, "Please turn on I Love Lucy"? So, position bias, item bias is another very important thing, namely, you can't really become fluent in your choices. There are difficulties in becoming fluent with choices, and vocabulary size is very restricted. Well, the second type of level system is the level system based on a dynamic screen, where the many symbols can be changed, and where the user, himself or herself, can do the changing. These systems seem to have solved, at first glance, the major problem with level systems, namely the extreme limitation of vocabulary. But in their solution of this problem, they have invoked another problem. And the problem they have invoked is navigating to where the desired vocabulary item is. Let me explain what I mean by this. If you were in a fast food restaurant and you were in the process of communicating to your attendant what you wanted to eat, and the attendant was going to interact, say, for you with the wait person or the server or the order taker, and a friend or a parent, someone comes up and says, "Hello, Bill, how are you?" What would you have to do? Well, I don't think "my name isn't Bill" or "what is your name" or any of those social kinds of things would be on your fast food overlay. So you would navigate to another overlay. Could you navigate directly? Well, if you had, say, 20 overlays, you would have to have 20 different selections. So you probably wouldn't do that, so you'd have to navigate to a central overlay. And from that central overlay, you would then have to re-navigate to a social overlay. And then you'd have to know what sort of social things are on that overlay. So I don't want to protract what is kind of an obvious need to navigate through, but I do want to underscore that in dynamic level systems, the many, many symbols produce an unintended side effect, and that is the need to navigate through to them. The main difference between the dynamic systems and the static systems understood in this way is who can do the navigating. But the cognitive loads of navigation in the dynamic system this time don't fall on a facilitator, they would fall on a system operator. So we can say with the dynamic level system that the operator need only hit or touch or select or however or scan to that particular vocabulary unit that he or she wants, but something else has to happen. And here are the different things that a system operator needs to know. Users need to know what vocabulary they have, where they have it stored, and how to get to it. This is substantially more complicated than the static level system and is caused by the need to navigate through the very large symbol set. So, in summary, let me say that we have looked at level systems and we have seen how they take advantage of the few symbols in a sequence and try to handle the large symbol set by helping a user, either statically with the help of an outside facilitator, only have those symbols that are appropriate, or dynamically, allowing the user to navigate to his or her vocabulary. So, let's go back to our 4 paradigms in augmentative communication, and we see that we have looked at 3 of them. Abbreviations and letter-based word prediction dealt with the reducing the many symbols in a sequence, and levels took advantage of the few symbols in a sequence provided by concept systems and tried to handle the large symbol set. Before I talk about semantic compaction, I would like to talk about some issues in human interfacing, and in particular issues in human interfacing that relate specifically to augmentative communication. Here's an equation that deals with several factors that I think are very important in augmentative communication, as in any other activity of life, and they are motivation, cognitive, physical effort, and time. In augmentative communication, these things have a very special and sharp point, because we have to look at the motivation individuals have to communicate and the degree to which they have success using their communication aids. This equation expresses the notion that there is a proportional relationship between motivation and cognitive and physical effort. And the way I phrased it is that the motivation to say something divided by the cognitive and physical effort across time that it takes to do it has to reduce to a fraction equal to or greater than 1. Let me state that in straight prose. The motivation to say something has to be greater than the cognitive and physical effort it takes to say it. Let me state it in a reverse way. If the cognitive and physical effort it takes to say something is greater than the motivation to communicate, it will not be communicated. How many of us have ever seen an augmentative communication system which required greater cognitive and physical effort to use than there was motivation to communicate? Well, I'm sure we all have. In fact, that's almost more likely to happen than not, because for most of us, we experience interacting as automatic processing. This is a term taken from cognitive psychology, and it refers to those things we do without thinking, like going down a staircase. For those of us who are able-bodied, going down a staircase, we need only hold just gently on the railing, and our legs more or less do the rest. That's called automatic processing. Our language is like that for most of us. When we were taking foreign language in a high school and tried to learn a foreign language, well then we understood what it was like when the language was not automatic, and it could become very difficult. So automatic processing is a very important way of looking at the amount of energy it takes to do something. Automatic processing is our biggest weapon in lowering the cognitive and physical effort it takes to use a communication aid. Now I would like to say something about vocabulary size and automatic processing. This is almost a trick question, but what do you think? Can a person become automatic on a small vocabulary or on a substantial vocabulary more readily? Well, as contradictory as this seems, it is easier to become automatic on a substantial vocabulary than on a small vocabulary. Because a small vocabulary is not a vocabulary you can use in enough situations so that you can have habitual experience in using it for your own motivation. And now I would like to point out something that I think is a very important notion in augmentative communication. And that is that expressive competence comes from the habitual use of language to fulfill one's own needs. And this is very different from the contrived language situations of the classroom. For those of us who took 2 or 3 years of Spanish and really didn't learn it, or 2 or 3 years of French and really didn't learn it, I think you know what I mean. If you do not use language to fulfill your own needs, it never really becomes part of your processing so that it can become automatic. So I would just like to express this notion again, that expressive competence comes from the habitual use of language to fulfill one's own needs, and that you cannot fulfill your own needs with language without a substantial vocabulary. And so a substantial vocabulary is needed for automatic processing, and automatic processing is our best weapon to encourage communication aid use and to encourage expressive communication. Now I feel it's appropriate to talk about semantic compaction, because we've put on the table many of the issues and goals in augmentative communication. And the reason I want to talk about semantic compaction after I've talked about automatic processing and after I've talked about the need for having a substantial vocabulary to develop automatic processing, semantic compaction is an appropriate thing to discuss, because the very core of semantic compaction is the notion that you're going to encode a substantial vocabulary. And the technique used is very similar to techniques used in ancient hieroglyphics. To describe these techniques, what I'm going to do is talk about 2 fundamentally different kinds of graphic representation systems. The first kind are what I will call sound graphics. These are graphics based on sound. The second kind I'm going to call concept graphics. These are graphics based upon concepts. Here is a sound graphic. It's a G. Now what's the value given to G? Well, how do you pronounce G? Well, you pronounce it G. Well, G as in sign? Well, I think not. You know, I'm playing a little game with you. We all know that G can have various values depending on where it's used. For instance, in this word, well, it would be a sin to take it out. But in this word, the G serves to lengthen the preceding vowel and also to let us know that words like signature and signal are related to a fundamental root word sign. If we were to take it out, some of the semantic underpinnings of our language would disappear, as well as wind up with words that were spelled alike and seem to be different. So sound graphics have very interesting qualities. Namely, you do not know what they're going to do, what role they're going to play, what value they're going to have, until you see them actually used. This quality is called virtuality. Our sound graphics are virtual. But then again, so are the words, so are the sounds they represent. Let's take a look at the word run. What does run mean? She had a run in her stocking, there was a dry run at the foot of the hill. Will Michael Dukakis run in 1996? Well, I hope he does. He runs 2 miles a day, every day. Why should he stop running in 1996? What has happened here is I've used run in 3 different, almost unrelated ways, and we couldn't tell which meaning run had, what value run had, until we saw it used in its actual sentence. So not only are our sound graphics virtual, but the words that they represent are virtual. Another quality sound graphics have is that they're arbitrary. By that I mean the linkage between this graphic and any of the roles that it plays is a linkage set up by convention. Namely, this doesn't illustrate in any way any of the roles that G plays. It is arbitrary. Are our words arbitrary as well? Well, take a look at all the different meanings of run. Does the sound run represent any of those meanings? Does it illustrate any of those meanings in any realistic way? Not at all. So not only are our sound graphics virtual and arbitrary, but our sound-based language is virtual and arbitrary. Well, this is not the case with conceptual graphics. That's not what we want out of a concept graphic. For instance, take a look at this concept graphic. What does it mean? Well, it means no smoking. We knew it the first time we saw it that it meant no smoking, and that's what it means, and it doesn't mean anything else. So rather than being arbitrary, it is what? It is illustrative. Rather than being virtual, it is unambiguous. But that's just because this is how our culture treats concept graphics. Concept graphics have not always been treated in that manner. For instance, in the Maya hieroglyphic system used by the Maya people, a Mesoamerican people living between what is now northern Guatemala and southern Mexico, had an elaborate hieroglyphic system. The Maya hieroglyph for shark is also the Maya hieroglyph for the ocean. And it's also the Maya hieroglyph for green because the Maya thought the ocean was green. When you're reading a royal jewelry catalog and come across shark, what it means there is jade. This quality, sometimes called polysemy, this multi-meaningness, is the way traditional cultures have recorded their language. What is the advantage to this kind of language recording? Why am I bringing it up? It's how the Egyptians recorded their language, mixing phonetic and conceptual elements. I'm bringing it up because what it does, it has a strong impact on reducing the number of graphics needed to represent language. Reflect back on our model. We have conceptual-oriented systems with short symbol strings, but we had large symbol sets because we gave only one and one meaning to each graphic. If we were to introduce in a controlled, conscious way the notion of virtuality into concept graphics, we can lower dramatically the number of symbols needed for a symbol set. For instance, what does a round red apple mean? Does it mean round, or red, or apple, or fruit, or can it mean all of those? By short sequences, we can in fact interpret what those meanings would be and enter into a world that I would liken unto semantic spelling. If I were to be asked what Minspeak is, or what semantic compaction is, I would say that it is the conscious introduction of controlled virtuality into concept-oriented graphics. The reason we do this is first to lower the number of icons so an individual can have represented on his or her overlay, without needing to change or needing to navigate to different overlays, all the vocabulary items that he or she needs to communicate with, and that these vocabulary items are simultaneously available. Because for automatic processing, you need to have a vocabulary, a substantial vocabulary, that will allow you to use your own language for your own needs in a variety of purposes, or your own variety of purposes. This will promote automatic processing, lower the cognitive and physical effort, and enhance overall vocabulary and language performance. To understand how semantic compaction works, however, we need to take a step back from our usual orientation of one graphic equals one meaning and recognize for a moment that a graphic has many different possibilities in it. that these possibilities are often innate to it and can be exploited for our own ends the way children sometimes exploit multi-meaningness of graphics. I'd like to give an example here of just how it works. If we were to set up a picture writing system, we could sequence house and elephants to mean zoo. We could also sequence house and money to mean bank. We could sequence house and the medical symbol to mean hospital. But then if we were to have a rainbow, we could also sequence rainbow and house to mean brown if the house in this graphic were brown. We could sequence rainbow and money to mean green if the money illustrated happened to be a dollar bill. And if the elephants that were used with house were also gray, as elephants are, we could sequence rainbow and elephants to mean gray. So we see that we have a variety of different meanings that can be derived from a single icon. The way a semantic compaction icon set is derived is a very straightforward process, and I've participated many times in such activities. The first step is to collect the notions that you want to encode. For natural language, I recommend collecting about 300 notions that might be of use to your augmented communicator. The notion of size, the notion of bigness, the notion of smallness, happiness, emotions themselves. All of these should be listed in a notional syllabus. The detail to which one goes in that kind of a notional syllabus can easily be limited by setting an arbitrary limit around 300. That's what we found most convenient. Out of that notional syllabus, one can then extract 50 notions, separated by semantic distance and also selected by importance. If one then gives an illustration showing a real-life, everyday object or common convention, such as the way we might draw a lightning bolt, to each one of those 50 notions, you will soon find that what one notion, for instance, a pumpkin drawn, a jack-o'-lantern drawn with an angry face to express anger, can also mean pumpkin pie, and could also mean Halloween, and in another way could mean garden. So what we find is that as we acquire a list, a collection of 50 or more icons, that the interactions among those icons, very simple interactions among those icons, allows us to establish categories and to disambiguate within those categories large amounts of vocabulary. And we can encode words, phrases, and sentences in that vocabulary and remain on a single overlay. I would like to show you how such a system works, and the overlay I'm going to show you is kind of a generic overlay that was, however, established according to the process, but it wasn't established for any particular client. So it has some icons which represent notions that only an educated adult would use. For instance, we use Shakespeare, and we have other notions like a juvenile-looking little boy who has a kind of cartoon ring that would only be used, say, in an adolescence system. But we have these together, and they were selected according to a process that I described, and the goal was to show an overlay that had all the different possibilities for all the different populations within augmentative and alternative communication. Here we have an example of a Minspeak or semantic compaction system running on the Prenke-Romic Liberator. Notice that a light is on the brown house, indicating that it is the initial icon in a sequence of icons. Let me hit the icon for house, and let's say we want to produce the word zoo. So we want to have icon and elephant. Let me hit the house icon,
Notice the elephant icon now lights up, telling me that these selections here are valid sequences producing a meaning associated with house. So now I select elephants.
Zoo.
Here's house again. What are our other valid selections? Well, there's a graduation cap, and we find
School.
school. The house and the dollar bill. We find,
Bank.
all right, here's a rainbow. Rainbow. An elephant. What color might we get here?
Gray.
Rainbow and house.
Brown.
So we see a series of different meanings can be represented on a single overlay by using and reusing a small collection of icons in very short sequences. And in the case with the Liberator, a system operator can be prompted as to category and meaning by lights. Minspeak, or semantic compaction, addresses the two primary goals that we set out earlier for augmentative communication. First, we have expressive competence. By the technique's ability to represent a substantial vocabulary, most of the commercially available application programs have language groups represented going anywhere from 300 to 5,000 words, phrases, and sentences. Because of the system's ability, proven ability, to represent a substantial vocabulary on a single overlay without having to navigate back and forth amongst a series of levels, the system enhances expressive competence and allows a system operator to have the language that he or she really needs to express him or herself. And second, the use of literacy is enhanced by the fact that the icons are accompanied by letters, and in fact in many of the sequences take advantage of the letter element on the associational location as part of their meaning. It's one thing to see a house without a letter. It's another thing to see H and house. It's the beginning of phonics. It in itself, each and every overlay, can become a medium for the development of literacy skills. And because the systems have the ability readily, particularly Touch Talker, Light Talker, and Liberator, readily to switch into spelling mode, and sometimes can perceive when the system operator needs spelling, these instruments can become tools for literacy acquisition for a broad population. So in closing, I would like to say that semantic compaction is an ancient technique, was once used as a shorthand for oral culture, but applied to computer technology can become a very powerful environment for expressive communication that requires relatively few actuations in relationship to, say, spelling, can promote automatic processing, and at the same time be a source and groundwork for establishing literacy.